Hey guys, welcome to the CO visit. Colin here, and always my trusty coffee. Well, I appreciate you clicking on this video. Welcome back once again. Today we're going to have a little biblical discussion. You saw the title of the video, so I'm going to talk about beliefs. Well, they're biblical accounts, but tied into how Watchtower portrayed them. And then, of course, in recent light, no pun intended, about a year ago when governing body king, Jeffrey Jackson, made these bombshell claims about a few of them. And we're going to talk about those today. But these were things that never added up to me, even as an active, indoctrinated Jehovah's Witnesses. I didn't necessarily talk to it about anybody or be vocal about it, but I wasn't the only one either. There were others that shared these points of views. So we're going to have this nice laid-back discussion. Thanks for being here. Like and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Won't cost you a thing. And there's also memberships. There's the super thanks, all that stuff. If you want to contribute, it's appreciated. So let's get right into it. So first of all, and I'm going to go in order here. I actually have notes. Took notes. I was working on this morning. So I'm going to go in order of where these appear in the Bible. All right, I'm going to put my copy aside there. So the first one I want to talk about, one of the big ones, is Noah's Ark. Okay, Noah particularly, Noah. I'm not going to get into all the, supposedly science stuff and, how it was probably impossible to have that many animals in one ark and where did he get them and all that. I'm not talking about that. Okay, talking about Watchtower's take on this. So first of all, when we read about in Genesis 6, interesting detail here, okay? Because in Jeffrey Jackson's New Light at this annual meeting a year ago, he gave this new understanding that now they understood that Noah probably didn't have realistically time to be preaching while he was building the ark. And so now Jehovah has revealed to him that he will resurrect people from that time. Now, interesting that where do I even start with this? When you read in Genesis chapter 6, Jehovah comes to Noah, gives him the commission to build the ark. If you read that account, it's very clear that God tells Noah that he's establishing a pact or a covenant with you, right? He says, I'm establishing this covenant with you and your family to build the ark. So you can see from that account that the plan from day one is that the only people who were going to survive were Noah, his wife, his daughters, and their husbands, and the animals. This never included anybody else. There was absolutely no reason at any point for Noah to be out there supposedly going to preach. And you know what the Watchtower always did? They used that to compare it to the ministry, right? Well, look at Noah went out and preached because in Hebrews, it says he's a preacher of righteousness, right? Well, preaching is not going out to people necessarily. People can come to you. Noah was busy. In that part, they're right? So a lot of us, myself included, I felt finally, that's what I always believed, but they still screwed it up so bad and blasphemed, just like they're going to do with another one we're going to talk about here today. If you're an active witness and you're watching this, you have to realize that your governing body not only is completely wrong on this issue and one other, but it's blasphemy. They're speaking against God. They're telling something that is not true. It's a lie. The Bible does not say this. It is completely against any type of Christian belief system and the Bible itself to say that Jehovah will resurrect some people from Noah's day. No, he won't. And the reason why he made a pact only with Noah, the ark was only for him. Nobody was getting into it because God already pronounced judgment. He already read the hearts of all the people. He said the earth was ruined. The thoughts of people all the time were bad and violent. But Noah was the exception and his family. All the other people were condemned. This was a divine sentence. Any other possible conclusion that you could extrapolate from that would be wrong, because you're saying that, oh, well, whoops, so Noah was building this ark, so he didn't go preaching. He didn't need to go preaching anyway, but so God kind of messed up there, and his angels, I mean, what were they doing? They could have gone out and warned people, right? They didn't do it. So now, like as an afterthought, oh, guess what, guys? I got to resurrect some people there. Oops. No, that's blasphemy. And they should know that. When you read the account, it's very clear. So that was one. I never agreed with that. Another one is, moving on here, Genesis 13. We read about accounts of Abraham and Lot. Okay, I'm going to focus on Lot. And this is another one because the Bible also in Hebrew says righteous Lot. Okay, and in particular, I never really looked at Lot as being particularly righteous. And interestingly, I was just watching this past week. I watched several. This kind of got me the idea of doing this video. I was watching several different videos from these channels about Bible scholars, and they were talking about this issue of Lot and how Jewish tradition views him, and some of the other writings that got, not in the Bible. And so when they look at that, Lot was very hard-headed and he was disobedient. Okay, so Abraham and Lot, we know that they had this falling out. You remember in the Bible, and in Genesis 13, they had to separate because they were both like pastors and they had livestock, and they were fighting with each other. So Abraham said, hey, let's separate. You go one way, I'll go the other way. Just choose where you want to go. Well, Lot chose to go to a city. He went to move into a city, which for them, and God never had that intention for his people. Never. And he goes and he establishes himself right in the middle of two of the absolute worst cities that existed at that time among pagan people. And then had to live with the consequences. So in Jewish tradition, it says that Lot was very active and he was well known in his city in Sodom. And but it's interesting that once again, in this case, Jeffrey Jackson, in the annual meeting, after he was talking about Noah and all of that, and he also included in there Sodom and Gomorrah. And he said that nobody preached to the people in Sodom and Gomorrah. There was no warning. And so some people would be resurrected from there. Once again, blasphemy and a complete lie. If you look at Sodom and Gomorrah, that's why in chapter 18, later on, chapter 18, it talks about where Abraham attempts to intercede for Sodom and Gomorrah. You remember that account where he was talking to God and he said, it's unthinkable. You're going to wipe away all the righteous people with the evil ones, the sinners? What if there's this many, and he, was counting down, and God said, okay, if there's 50, if there's 40, if there's 30, if there's 20, if there's 10. Once again, Sodom and Gomorrah, just like the Noah's day, was a divine sentence. Nobody messed up there. Nobody, afterthought, oh, whoops, I guess there were some righteous people. We should have warned them. God already knew the hearts of all those people. He condemned them. It was a divine sentence. Nothing was ever going to change in those cities, ever, till the end of time. So he executed them. But here comes Jeffrey Jackson and says, yes, they will. So that, I don't know, like I've always said, like the governing body doesn't think these things through. Did they not think about Genesis chapter 18? Because if what they're saying is true, then that means that Abraham was right. All along, after all this time, we find out Abraham was right in questioning God. God was being unfair. Okay. So let's move on. Oh, one other thing. No, before I move on here, Genesis chapter 19. So we look at the case of Lot's daughters as well. And this was something that until recently, like I said, when I was watching some videos and things, I never thought about this aspect of it. So when we look about what happened with Lot's daughters, and also this comes from Jewish history that I was watching on these channels of biblical scholars. And they looked at the fact that Lot himself, and especially his children, they were born and they were raised in this city. So they were influenced by the practices that happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. So they weren't innocent little creatures, even though they were virgins. But they were used to what was going on there, and they didn't view those things necessarily as bad because they grew up in it. Maybe Lot did, because he had lived outside of those cities before. His experience was much different, and he knew of Jehovah, but his daughters didn't. They had no concept of that, and they grew up in this horrible, sexually perverse society. So it's interesting that when you see after they left the city, they fled to the mountains, and they're in this cave, and Lot's daughters were worried about not being able to bear children. Like, how are we going to bear children now? We're in these caves. There's no men around, right? What are we going to do? And so when you look at their actions, it's indicative of this, of what these scholars were talking about. And it adds up and it makes perfect sense. I was like, whoa, mind blown. Amazing. And I always knew like something was off about this, but I just didn't know what it was. And now I'm learning these things, and it's amazing. So his daughters, instead of what you would think that, family members of Lot, Abraham would do, trusting in Jehovah, maybe praying to him, crying out to him, and getting a blessing or being able to have children later on, having a promise from God, they didn't do that. They turned to the influence that they had, what they knew. They didn't know Jehovah. What they knew was Sodom and Gomorrah and that culture and that lifestyle. So what did they do? They got together. They concocted this plan. 2 nights. I'm going to go in there, says the oldest one, get dad drunk, screw him, and I'm going to get pregnant. The next night, you do the same thing. And that's what they did. So when you look at that, you go, oh my God, it makes perfect sense. You see, they thought nothing of doing that. That would have been abominable to any other Hebrew girl if she would have been raised in a different family or in a different circumstances. But they went back to what they knew. What they knew was Sodom and Gomorrah. So let's have sex with dad and we'll have children. And they did. And what happened? Well, they became the mothers to the Ammonites and the Moabites, 2 historically enemies of God's people, which they later had to fight with and exterminate them and all of that. And so that's how you understand why, for example, in Noah's day, one of Noah's sons, Cam, became the father of the Canaanites, because he did something sexual with Noah. And then the same with Lot's 2 daughters. And so you can understand the hatred, and also why it was detestable to God, the Canaanites and all those peoples, because they were blood of God's chosen people. Later on, they had Noah's descendants, the Canaanites. And the Ammonites and the Moabites had Lot's, and because of that, Abraham's, indirectly, descendants as well. So a lot of animosity there because they're distant family, all of them. So moving on, here's another jewel. Here's another classic one, okay? Samson. This is another one I had big issues with in the Bible. And one thing you have to understand, guys, is that some of the examples in the Bible, even though they might have been acting because God chose them, they weren't doing what he wanted them to do necessarily. So we have Samson, Judges 14, and that was another one that, and of course they say, oh, according to Watchtower, Samson was faithful and Samson was this and that, and no, he wasn't. Samson was a fiend, not faithful. Wrong F word, fiend. Okay, you've got Samson, first of all, right away, Judges chapter 14, Samson, first thing he does, takes a Philistine wife. That's not what he was supposed to do. God wanted him to fight against the Philistines. He wanted him to exterminate them, free his people, not marry one of them. So Samson went for the route of, oh, let's make a marriage pact and then we'll have peace. And well, that didn't work. That was the start of his downfall. That was not God's purpose. And then we have Samson in Judges chapter 16, another famous account where he comes to this Philistine city. And what does he do? First thing he sees on the outskirts of the town, the house of a hooker, a prostitute. And he goes in there and says he came to her, which in biblical language means he had sex with her. And he stayed there the night with her. So here you got Samson murdering people, marrying Philistine women, sleeping with prostitutes, doing all this just tremendous stuff. Okay, but yet we're supposed to look at him as an example of faith, of following Jehovah. No, my friends, wrong again. Another one from the wonderful book of Judges. This is one of my favorites, one of my favorite ones to talk about that I never agreed with, and I always knew because of the language and what was used in that chapter, that Watchtower was wrong. The governing body was wrong, and they're still wrong. Judges chapter 11, where it talks about Jephthah, one of the judges, Jephthah, and then the account of his daughter. What happens there? Big controversy. This is something that also blasphemy. This is something they have twisted. They lie about it, and they want to use this to encourage young sisters to dedicate their time to being pioneers. Like Jephthah's daughter was the first pioneer. She was dedicated to Jehovah's service. No, she wasn't. And the Jehovah's Witnesses are the only religion that teach this BS. So it says in Judges chapter 11, verse 30, that Jephthah makes his infamous oath to Jehovah. So he says, if I defeat these enemies, when I come back, if I'm victorious, the first person that comes out of my house to meet me, and he says, I will offer, as some translations say Holocaust, others say burnt offering. Now, I really came to a better understanding of this account when I started reading the account in the Reina Valera Bible here in Honduras in Spanish. Very, very old Bible translation. And when you read that, it uses the word Holocaust, holocausto, in Spanish, Holocaust. Holocaust, just in case you're wondering, comes from Greek. So the Greek translations later on, the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, use the word holocaustos with K, K-A-U-T-S-T-O-S, kaustos, holocaustos, okay? Which in Greek would be translated as burnt sacrificial offering, burnt sacrificial offering. And so Jephthah says that he makes this oath to Jehovah, whoever comes out of my tent or my house to meet me, I will offer as a holocaust, a burnt sacrificial offering. Nothing to interpret there. Absolutely nothing to interpret. The problem is later on, where what the Watchtower teaches about this, until this day, you can find this on jw.org, they talk about the singleness of Jephthah's daughter, that she remained single, that she served Jehovah for the rest of her life. No, she didn't. Okay, was she single? Yes. But you know for how long? Well, in verse 37, first of all, when she comes out, Jephthah sees her and it is torn apart. He rips his clothing, he starts crying, and he tells her about what has to happen. And so she asks her father permission to go cry for her virginity for 2 months. So she was only single for 2 more months. She was a virgin. And then in verse 39, it says after the 2 months were over, she came back, and then Jephthah carried out his vow with her. So one of the things that always called my attention was the way Watchtower describes this is that, oh, it's symbolic. It's not that he offered her as a sacrifice. It's in the sense that she couldn't have children anymore and she had to serve in the temple or whatever. That's what they say, right? But that's not really coherent, and it's not congruent with the reaction that Jephthah had and she did. Look at the reaction. Jephthah was in anguish. He ripped his clothing in a sign of deep, deep, deep anguish. But he had to follow his vow. So, and the girl as well. She wanted to go for 2 months and cry over the fact that she was going to die a virgin. She was not going to have children. Now, some people might say, oh, he was crying because he wouldn't be able to carry on his family name. His daughter wouldn't have children. That's not true. That's not true. You see, Jephthah, it doesn't say in the account, okay? We can probably extrapolate that maybe yes, but in the case that Jephthah didn't have any boys, males, he would have no reason to be so anguished if it was just over, oh, my daughter's going to be in the temple for the rest of her life and she won't have children. That wouldn't matter because she wouldn't carry on the name anyway. Women did not carry on the family name. The men did. So if he did have boys, well, then that wouldn't make any difference. It wouldn't make any difference. They would carry on the name, not her. But it makes perfect sense when you look at this exactly what it says. This is not symbolic. This is not that she was going to go serve in the temple. Remember, Jephthah was not like a faithful servant of Jehovah. He didn't know Jehovah. Again, at this time, when you look at the book of Judges, Israel was so removed from the law and serving Jehovah, the whole nation was corrupted. They were basically pagan. But Jehovah was choosing these people to try to get the nation back to where it needed to be. But Jephthah knew nothing about Jehovah. He was not a servant of Jehovah. So there's no reason to think that, oh, I'm going to send my daughter to go serve with the Levites in Jerusalem or whatever. That makes no sense whatsoever. And his reaction does not match up with that reality. She would still be alive. You could still go see her. So why are you so upset? Why are you so anguished? He was anguished because it is exactly what it says here. He was going to kill her. He was going to sacrifice her because that's what they were doing in Israel in those days. They were performing sacrifices, and that's what Jephthah mistakenly thought in his mind that he had to do to please God. I have to sacrifice. Now, another thing that's interesting is if you make a reference to that scripture, and this is what I did when I was reading the Bible in Spanish many years later, you make a reference to Genesis 22, chapter 2, and in that account is where Jehovah told Abraham to go and sacrifice Isaac, his only son. And he said, I want you to offer up Isaac as, once again, in Spanish, it uses the exact same word, Holocaust. Holocaust translated into English, burnt sacrificial offering. It's the same word, just different languages. There's nothing symbolic about that at all. And when we talk about Genesis, it's interesting the cognitive dissonance there and the disconnect that Watchtower does, where in Genesis 22, it's a sacrifice. He was going to sacrifice Isaac. He was going to kill him. But in Judges chapter 11, it wasn't. It was just symbolic. Because the reality of that is so terrible that the witnesses don't want to face it. They don't know how to explain it. So they say, well, it was just symbolic. She didn't die. She was just single for the rest of her life. No, my friends, she died. That's why he was so anguished about it. That's why his daughter had to go and cry for her virginity for 2 months. And that's why her friends later on kept like going to cry for her and remembering her. She was dead. So my friends, if you're still with me, thanks for being here this far in this video. I know this is a little bit longer one, but this is, a lot of these things are the things that did not add up for me. And you can see how what was really fascinating to me too is that other religions don't run away from these accounts. They don't skirt around them. They don't try to manipulate the scriptures to change it because they think, oh, that sounds really bad. They don't do that. They face it head on. They say, yes, Jephthah killed his daughter. Okay, now deal with it. Yes, Samson was a fiend, but that's in the Bible for a reason, not to show how faithful he was, to show that he wasn't doing, and he did not do what God told him to do. Yes, he killed like 3,000 Philistines in the end, but he didn't wipe them out like he was supposed to. And that's why God gave him those supernatural powers, but he wasted it. So anyway, those are just some of the things that, even when I was an active witness, didn't add up for me. They didn't add up for me. And that's why, if you're out there and you're an active witness watching these things, you need to do more research outside of Watchtower, because you're not going to get the answers there. You're not going to get the proper understanding of the scriptures by this. And the reason why is because they don't have Holy Spirit. And if you're a witness, you don't either. And you cannot properly understand the things in the Bible without the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And since you don't believe in the Holy Spirit, as the rest of Christianity does, you're never going to receive it. So you're getting denied that. So I invite you, as witnesses, do that. If you're here watching this video, you're already taking that step anyway. It's already an act of disobedience. So why stop there? Okay, thank you for watching this video. I appreciate it very much. Thanks for being here. Love all of you. Be blessed. And I'll see you in the next CO visit.